Hi, in this lecture you will hear about interethnic relations from the early 16th to the early 21st century. As one of the authors of the corresponding chapter, I'm happy to represent the voices of all the colleagues from various European universities who collaborated on this unit. We should begin with some possible definitions. Ethnicity or ethnic group is a commonly used but fuzzy concept. Most dictionary definitions stress that ethnicity presupposes a group of people that share a number of communal identity features, the most frequently invoked being language, culture, traditions, rituals, sometimes religion, and the sense of common descent. I will investigate the ways societies have talked and thought about ethnicity from the early 1500s to the early 2000s, reflecting on the notions that had been common before ethnicity as a term came into use in the 20th century. I will also devote attention to ethnic relations in successive historical periods, quoting examples from various parts of Europe and focusing on certain distinct groups. The first part of the lecture discusses early modern conceptions of ethnic difference before investigating ethnic coexistence and conflict in Europe through the example of Poland-Lithuania. It then turns to a discussion of the status and treatment of Jews and the Romani people, often referred to as gypsies, at the hands of majority populations. Finally, it briefly explores the place of European indigenous peoples, such as the Sámi of Scandinavia. How did contemporaries think about ethnicity in the early modern period? From today's point of view, ethnicity appears to be a ubiquitous category in early modern texts. Contemporaries clearly distinguished between Germans, Italians, French, Poles, Turks, and so on, and there was considerable fascination with the different languages, customs, national character, and styles of dress associated with different peoples. These interests are amply attested to by ethnographic descriptions included in geographical texts, travel accounts, and missionary reports, as well as numerous manuscripts and printed costume books. Nevertheless, for most of the early modern period, there was no general theory or widely accepted concept of ethnicity in the modern sense, even as contemporaries freely used ethnonyms and grouped individuals into peoples and nations. These concepts often remained ambiguous, combining and conflating ethnic, geographic, linguistic, and religious identifications, and sometimes indicated that certain people were subjects of a given ruler, such as the King of Spain. A telling example, ostensibly ethnic terms such as Turk at once designated a Muslim and the subject of the Ottoman Sultan. The phrase "to turn Turk," found in numerous European languages, denoted religious conversion to Islam. Ethnonyms frequently served the purpose of constructing the otherness of different communities, especially to exclude perceived aliens such as Jews and Roma. How did the early modern concept of nation differ from our present-day understanding of the term? The term nation, although used relatively frequently in early modern sources, did not imply the same degree of ethnic, linguistic, and political homogeneity which was associated with it in the 19th and 20th centuries. In administrative terms, a nation was usually a loose grouping of people with similar geographic, linguistic, and religious characteristics. This also means that our 20th and 21st century concepts of nationality are largely inadequate for understanding early modern ethnic relations and the early modern usage of the word nation. The shift towards a more systematic distinction of ethnic groups occurred only in the late 17th and 18th centuries with the formulation of theories of race. Such attempts to establish a scientific categorization of human beings, which built on Carl Linnaeus' system of taxonomy, were stimulated by European interactions with the inhabitants of other parts of the world. The term race acquired its modern meaning of membership in a biologically defined ethnic group, which nevertheless remained culturally and socially constructed. Proponents of race theory, like Immanuel Kant, enshrined ideas of alterity which could be used to provide justification for colonial rule and slavery. The majority of countries in early modern Europe were ethnically diverse. This is most obvious in the case of territorially extensive polities such as the Habsburg and Ottoman realms, but significant ethnic diversity existed in other states as well. If we look for an example of an ethnically diverse early modern state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would easily come to mind. It came to exist after the union of Poland and Lithuania in 1569, and it was one of the 6 largest European polities. Although formally it was an elective monarchy, contemporaries already referred to Poland-Lithuania as the Republic of Poland, Rzeczpospolita, because of the great political influence of the wealthiest part of the nobility, the magnates. The union brought together a staggering variety of beliefs and languages. As for the ethnic or ethno-religious groups, after the union with Lithuania, Poles still formed around 50% of the overall population, whereas 40% were Lithuanians and Ruthenians, with the remaining 10% made up of Germans, Jews, non-Lithuanian Balts, and other ethnicities, including Armenians, Jews, Karaite, Romani, Tatars, Vlachs, and others. Some groups living in Poland-Lithuania enjoyed limited forms of communal autonomy. The greatest measure of autonomy was accorded to the Jewish community, which had the right to administer its members across Poland-Lithuania, independent of their specific places of residence. Stateless and scattered across numerous countries, Jews and Roma were often referred to as strangers within by the dominant societies of early modern Europe. However, a clear ethnic, social, or religious classification was considered difficult. Jews were understood as both an ethnic and a religious community. Their position was fraught with a great deal of ambivalence. While Christian majority societies sometimes regarded them as witnesses of faith who were worthy of protection, Jews were also aggressively stigmatized or even held responsible for the death of Christ. They often became scapegoats at times of epidemics when majority societies needed someone to blame. European Jews had been subjected to regular expulsions across the continent since the Middle Ages. Such measures were later frequently replaced by resettlement policies enacted by European rulers seeking economic and fiscal benefits from the skills, commerce, and financial network of Jewish people, but in other cases expulsion was permanent. Such a case was the expulsion of the Sephardic Jews from Spain in 1492. The term Sephardic refers to those Jews who lived in Spain and Portugal, whereas Ashkenazi refers to those Jewish communities which lived in German areas and later migrated to Eastern Europe. After the conquest of Granada, then the last remaining Islamic kingdom of the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish monarchs sought to homogenize their ethnically and religiously highly diverse subject populations. Sephardic Jews faced the choice of either baptism or execution if they refused to leave Spain. A similar measure in 1609 targeted Spanish Muslims called Moriscos and their descendants, feared to be an Ottoman fifth column. Both policies triggered massive migratory movements. While most Moriscos went to North Africa, the Jews scattered more widely, moving to Portugal, where they were in turn evicted in 1496-97, the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, Italy, and some cities in Northern Europe. Even those Iberian Jews who opted for conversion so that they were allowed to stay, the so-called conversos, were suspected of crypto-Judaism by the Spanish Inquisition. Furthermore, the proto-racist concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, functioned to preserve clear socio-symbolic boundaries between old and new Christians. Where the presence of Jews was tolerated, ecclesiastical and secular authorities made frequent attempts from the Middle Ages onwards to visually distinguish Jews from Christians through distinctive clothing and markings such as the yellow badge. Strict segregation was also a concern for Christians. Separate streets and city quarters, notably the Venetian ghetto established in 1516 and the segregation measures implemented by the Papal States by Pope Paul IV in 1555, created largely separate spheres of life. Legislation aimed at Jews was passed to regulate everyday interactions with Christians, for example by prohibiting unregulated interreligious disputations and sexual contact. Jews were excluded from membership in the guilds and numerous other fields of employment such as agriculture. Nevertheless, these laws and ordinances also protected Jewish life in combination with the existing safe conducts and provided limited rights of communal self-administration. The true emancipation of Jews, however, did not occur until the end of the early modern period, during the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, or in some areas even later. Like the Jews, the Roma, who had come to Western Europe at the beginning of the 15th century, soon faced considerable mistrust. Contemporaries apparently found it difficult to place the new minority into any clear category, and used contradictory ethnic labels such as Egyptians, Gypsies, and Tatars. The Romani word Roma does not appear in early modern sources. By the 16th century, Roma communities increasingly fell victim to marginalization and discrimination. Stigmatizing accusations of laziness, dishonesty, theft, robbery, fraud, espionage, magical practices, and bargaining with the devil made their situation much more difficult. In addition, numerous European territories tried to expel the Roma under the regulation of poor laws, which were aimed especially at itinerant groups. Despite these hardships, Roma worked as blacksmiths, basket makers, horse traders, construction and farm workers, traders, healers, entertainers, miners, soldiers, and even in law enforcement. They were often highly specialized workers and thus played a complex role in most early modern European societies, meaning that their history cannot be reduced to persecution. After a period of extensive persecution during the 18th century, a few countries launched new disciplinary policies to aggressively integrate and assimilate the Roma. In addition to older Spanish settlement initiatives, the enlightened rulers of the Habsburg Empire, Maria Theresa and Joseph II, enforced a rigid settlement policy, particularly in Burgenland in present-day eastern Austria. Early modern Europe also had some ethnic groups which are today recognized as indigenous peoples within Europe. Among these groups, the Sámi in northern Scandinavia formed one of the last remaining European groups of pre-Christian faith. Sámi was their name in their own language. Until the modern period, they were mostly called Laplanders. The largely but not exclusively nomadic reindeer-herding Sámi inhabited territories divided between Russia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Especially as suppliers of expensive furs, many Sámi groups were closely integrated into commercial networks in all three polities. Majority population's attitudes toward these indigenous people were always rather ambivalent. Although Christian missions to the Sámi had already been undertaken in the Middle Ages, the 17th and 18th centuries saw a renewal of state-backed Christianization efforts by Swedish and Norwegian Protestants, as well as Russian Orthodox monks. As we have seen, ethnic groups had existed before the 19th century and were mentioned by travelers, chroniclers, historians, and governmental officials. What the 19th century introduced was a sharpening and sometimes artificial creation of demarcation lines between various ethnic groups across Europe and their reconceptualization as nations, which came to be regarded as the legitimate basis for states. This part of the lecture will focus on the links between state building and homogenization efforts, as well as on the relationship between majority and minority groups. The second section will explore multi-ethnicity and multinational empires in Central and Eastern Europe, concentrating on the Habsburg Monarchy as a paradigmatic example. Finally, the Jewish case will be presented in a separate section as a special category of minority experiences. By the end of the early modern period, the common use of one dominant language had become the norm in several European monarchies. Although not all 19th century states strove to achieve language homogenization, most of them worked toward the marginalization of minority languages in one way or another and strove to curtail the autonomy of historic minorities. In France, a country which served as a model for many emerging nation states of 19th century Europe, the centralization of state power had progressed hand in hand with policies of language homogenization since the early modern period. With the emergence of nationalism and the ideal of the nation-state in 19th century Europe, efforts in favor of cultural homogenization became pronounced in several other European states as well. Education was seen as a particularly effective tool for transforming domestic populations into modern nations. The task of schools was, among other things, to raise good citizens and instill patriotic feelings in children. Therefore, educational systems were increasingly centralized and brought under state control. State languages assumed an increasingly dominant role in schools at the expense of minority languages. In 1880, for example, a nationally uniform school system was introduced in France, which left little or no room for regional languages such as Breton, Basque, or Occitan. However, even in countries with one dominant official language, a diversity of dialects prevailed, local languages survived, and significant ethnic minorities or nationalities continued to exist. The United Kingdom, officially the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland from 1801, is a case in point. Despite the common language, it has never become a nation-state per se. In 19th century Britain, the Irish, Welsh, Scots and smaller ethnic groups lived alongside the English and maintained their separate identities. These nations were all peoples of Celtic origin, descendants of the population that had lived on the British Isles since before the Anglo-Saxon conquest. Several members of those communities continued to use their own languages, although their struggles to ensure the survival of their native tongues were fought with varying degrees of success. In Ireland, Wales and Scotland, for example, the native Gaelic languages had long lost their primacy by the 19th century, and either bilingualism or the exclusive use of the English language had become the dominant pattern. Let's look at Spain as another variety. In 19th century Spain, centralizing tendencies followed the French model in many respects. The historic rights of significant minorities like the Basques were gradually suspended throughout the late 18th and the 19th century, and Spanish was declared to be the main language of the state. Nonetheless, regional cultural identities such as that of the Basques, Catalans, and Gallegos proved to be strong enough to withstand the Spanish monarchy's centralizing ambitions, and their languages survived, transforming into modern tongues during the 19th century. In countries that achieved unification in the second half of the 19th century, like Italy between 1859 and 1870, or Germany in 1871, common language and common cultural heritage were regarded as chief unifying factors. However, strong dialectal differences and regional identities survived in these countries too, thanks to centuries of territorial and political separation. On the other hand, both modern Italy and Germany were conceived as nation-states, and at least in Germany, there was perceptible pressure on minorities such as the Poles in the eastern provinces to assimilate. In binational states or dynastically connected countries with two large nations, ethnic relations and issues of national identity were complicated in a different way. Such countries were, for instance, Denmark, Norway, and later the personal union between Sweden and Norway. In other cases, new ethnically compound countries were created anew from territories previously ruled by other monarchies. Belgium is a case in point. A look at the ethnographic map of 19th century or early 20th century Europe shows that in terms of ethnicities or ethnic groups, Western Europe was seemingly more compact, while the greatest amount of ethnic fragmentation was to be found in Central and Eastern Europe. Such an impression is not completely erroneous, as indeed Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe marked the region of the continent where several empires met and chafed at the edges. However, an ethnographic map like that hides the complex reality of ethnicity throughout West and East. The German language map of 1914, which you can see on this slide, would probably invite lots of criticism today, and it may well have raised objections in its own time as well. Well into the 19th century, groups that might otherwise be represented as compact, for example the Germans, the French, or the Italians, did not in practice represent one single ethnicity, but rather myriads of regional dialects, local cultures, and worldviews, sometimes mutually unintelligible and foreign to one another. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, large parts of Central and Eastern Europe formed portions of multinational and multi-ethnic empires, like the Habsburg Monarchy, which after 1867 was called the Austro-Hungarian Monarchy, or simply Austria-Hungary, and the Russian Empire. The Ottoman Empire ruled the peoples of the Balkans, and although it was increasingly forced to give up control over territories during the 19th and early 20th centuries, it controlled a substantial part of southeastern Europe for much of that period. The German Empire, which came to exist in 1871, also included significant non-German populations as the result of Prussia's territorial acquisitions in earlier centuries. Let's now take a closer look at the ethnic relations in the Habsburg monarchy. Until the emergence of national movements in the first half of the 19th century, the multi-ethnic character of the Habsburg Empire didn't cause serious difficulties for Habsburg governments, nor did it lead to conflicts among diverse ethnic groups. However, early 19th century movements of national awakening, as they were called in Central and Eastern Europe, changed the situation thoroughly. These were primarily cultural movements, but they gradually acquired stronger political overtones. The ideology of modern nationalism was intertwined with liberal ideas. The peoples of the Habsburg monarchy were no longer content with the political system of the centralized empire and its absolutist government, and demanded greater individual rights and freedoms, as well as collective rights and autonomies. Linguistic and cultural communities increasingly defined themselves as nations. Emerging national movements within the Habsburg Empire often had conflicting goals and interests, and could be consciously pitted against each other by Austrian governments, as the revolutionary events of 1848-1849 amply demonstrated. After the creation of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy in 1867, the rights and political representation of nationalities were regulated differently in the two halves of the dual empire. You can read more about this in the corresponding subchapter. The nationality problem nonetheless plagued domestic politics in both halves of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and finally contributed substantially to its dissolution in 1918, although the constellations were diverse in the individual provinces. The sense of belonging to a distinct ethnic community was stronger in some cases and weaker in others, at least in the mid to late 19th century. But even in the former cases, ethnic identity was not simply out there, waiting to be taken to the fore by nationalists. Rather, national movements helped define and reinforce ethnic identities in the first place, building upon existing cultural markers such as language or religion. Ethnic identity was often unclear for many people, not to mention irrelevant to their everyday lives. Many people spoke two or more languages and switched depending on the situation, while identifying themselves primarily by profession, social status, place of living, or confession, rather than ethnicity or nationality. As the century progressed, people were increasingly forced to belong to neatly divided ethnic groups. In the Habsburg monarchy, modern censuses became powerful tools in this regard. But census data, in fact, often concealed bilingualism or the use of multiple languages, and were unable to reflect hybrid identities, shifting allegiances, and the complex situation of people with mixed ancestry. From the perspective of nationalist agitators, however, individuals characterized by national indifference or ambiguous identities were seen with growing disdain. On a different level, ethnic features were appropriated in newly invented national traditions and symbols, such as national costumes, or studied, classified, and displayed in the newly founded ethnographic museums and exhibitions. In multi-ethnic regions, but sometimes in more homogeneous ones too, larger towns and cities were often multi-ethnic and multi-confessional, including the capital cities and regional capitals of the late Habsburg Monarchy. Mass migration often thoroughly altered the ethnic composition of 19th century cities while transforming their social structure. Some of the major regional capitals, such as Prague or Lemberg, in Polish Lvov, in Ukrainian Lviv, in present-day Ukraine, became centers of competing national movements laying claims to public space. At the street level, territories and places were often contested and symbolically appropriated, and symbolic elements such as street signs, street names and churches of respective communities, and the choice of locations for coexisting nationalities' new public buildings acquired utmost importance. It would be misleading, however, to imagine fantasiacal cities as divided or extremely segregated. Interactions among members of different ethnic groups often took place on a daily basis, in spaces of leisure, work, and consumption, despite nationalist agitation encouraging people to follow precisely the opposite strategy. Members of ethnic communities were urged to shop with their retailers and to avoid mixed marriages. However, many individuals ignored those expectations and deliberately crossed ethnic boundaries. When it comes to interethnic relations, the position of the Jewish population deserves special attention. Even though statistically speaking, they were regarded as a religious group and not an ethnicity in most European countries by the late 19th century, they were perceived as an ethno-religious group by many contemporaries, and several members of Jewish communities, especially the Orthodox, also perceived themselves as such. Assimilated Jews, on the other hand, tended to identify themselves in the second half of the 19th century primarily as members of one of the European nations, such as the English, the French, Germans, Hungarians, and so on, depending on location and first language. The legal emancipation of Jews, which occurred at different times in different countries, theoretically created the possibility of full social integration for Jews. Throughout the 19th century, a broad spectrum of Jewish experiences existed, from strict adherence to religious tradition and traditional communities to advanced assimilation, depending on the period, the region, and on individual choice. However, the success of integration process depended significantly on the social, cultural, and political environments of individual countries, whereas the social integration of Jews reached generally high levels in Western and Northwestern Europe, antagonisms were more likely to prevail in East Central and Eastern Europe, where the proportion of Jews was significantly higher than in the western half of the continent. Not all segments of non-Jewish society accepted Jews in their ranks, and anti-Semites often called into question their Jewish compatriots' national loyalties, as well as their sincere identification with their homelands. Modern anti-Semitism, often and increasingly combined with racial theories by the turn of the 20th century, had complex ideological, social, and cultural roots, which cannot be analyzed here in detail. But the persistence of anti-Semitism in modern European societies had grave consequences later in the interwar period, when authoritarian or totalitarian regimes emerged across much of Europe. The remainder of this lecture will examine the changing relationships between majority and minority populations in Europe, with a particular focus on the more complex situation in multi-ethnic regions of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. While ethnic diversity in Eastern and Central European states was commonplace before 1918, the Versailles system of peace settlements established after World War I created radically new conditions. The dissolution of multi-ethnic empires was followed by the emergence of successor states whose legitimacy derived from the principle of national self-determination. But the new states were far from ethnically homogeneous units, and many ethnic groups found themselves dispersed outside of their nation-states. Incongruencies between cultural and political borders fostered major tensions both within and beyond individual nations during the interwar period. Legal measures were created to secure the rights of national minorities, such as those enshrined in the minority treaties that newly established states were obliged to sign in order to join the League of Nations. The League served as arbitrator in cases of alleged mistreatment of minorities, but cases could only be put forward by the recognized nation states that were members of the organization. In practice, many new states imposed the cultural dominance of the largest ethnic group and treated minorities that did not assimilate as unreliable or disloyal. World War II and its aftermath brought about a profound transformation of Central and Eastern Europe's ethnic conditions. The war itself triggered the flight and emigration of hundreds of thousands of people from territories invaded or annexed by Nazi Germany and its allies. The largest proportion of the refugees were Jewish by religion or by descent, but non-Jewish citizens also had reason to fear persecution on ethnic or political grounds, and thus fled in large numbers from countries like occupied Poland in 1939. As the war continued and the Nazis launched a policy of extermination toward Jews, about 6 million people of Jewish descent were murdered, all from European countries and areas which came under Nazi Germany's domination. Jewish emigration from Central and Eastern Europe during and after the war, and the demise of several Jewish communities thoroughly changed the composition and culture of those regions. Persecution and genocide also affected other groups in German-occupied countries and Nazi puppet states. For example, the Roma, up to 500,000 of whom fell victim to the Nazis and their allies in extermination camps and elsewhere. Movements of mass flight and forced migration unfolded from the eastern direction as well. When in 1939, following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Germany invaded Poland and occupied its western half, the Soviet Union simultaneously annexed eastern Poland and in 1940 forced the Baltic states to join the USSR. The Nazis then forced Baltic Germans, who had inhabited the region since the Middle Ages, to resettle within the Third Reich. As the Soviet front approached, the ethnic German population of East Prussia, today the Kaliningrad exclave of Russia, was evacuated en masse, never to return to their former homeland. At the end of World War II, the Allies instituted wartime arrangements that led to substantial border changes in Central and Eastern Europe, which were often accompanied by population exchanges, mass expulsions that forced several million people to relocate. To take Poland as an example, Germans were expelled from the Western territories incorporated into post-war Poland, while Polish citizens were forced to move out of the areas ceded to the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, a similar number of ethnic Belarusians and Ukrainians had to leave Poland and move to the neighboring Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics, areas which by then had become permanent parts of the Soviet Union. Almost everywhere in Eastern and Central Europe, the guiding principle behind expulsions and population exchanges was the drive of post-war governments to transform their countries into ethnically homogeneous states, an idea that was initially supported by all Allied powers as well. However, given the ethnic, linguistic, and denominational diversity of Central and Eastern Europe and the ethnic complexity of many of its subregions, homogeneity in most cases could only be achieved, if at all, by coercion. Expulsions and forced resettlement were designed partly to solve the nationality problem and partly to administer collective punishment, namely the punishment of those national minorities whose members had ostensibly supported Nazi Germany's territorial expansion and collaborated with the occupiers. The primary targets of collective punishment in East Central Europe were ethnic Germans, who were accused of having actively contributed to the dismemberment and subjugation of interwar states such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia between 1938 and 1945. But ethnic Germans were not the only minority targeted by forced resettlement policies. For example, under the so-called Population exchange treaties EGUS in 1946, ethnic Hungarians from Czechoslovakia and ethnic Slovaks from Hungary were expected to swap their domiciles. However, the figures on the two sides did not match, and population exchange arrangement in that case was merely a euphemism for forced relocation. Expulsions contributed to the ethnic homogenization of post-war countries, but also disrupted age-old patterns of coexistence. By placing people into rigid ethnic or national categories, expulsions often targeted those who had compound identities and those with multiple ties to their country and its communities. Although states in post-war Central and Eastern Europe perceptibly worked towards the greatest possible degree of homogeneity, several countries retained a multi-ethnic character and continued to have ethnic minorities after 1949. Policies regarding minorities varied from state to state and from period to period. The USSR was itself a multi-ethnic state with distinct policies toward non-Russian nationalities and ethnic groups. So satellite states could look to the Soviet Union for practical examples of how to handle nationalities within a multi-ethnic communist state. In some Eastern European communist countries, such as Hungary and Yugoslavia, the equality of all nationalities was stated in the constitution. In others, Czechoslovakia, for instance, the rights of nationalities were regulated by various laws. However, state socialism did little to cultivate the allegiances of minorities. Communist governments required citizens to identify primarily with the party and the state, usually regarding all other loyalties and identities with suspicion. Where national minorities were permitted to have their own institutions, such as schools, cultural associations, organizations, events, newspapers, or regular radio and television programs, these were closely monitored and kept under strict state control. The case of the Roma in countries of the Eastern Bloc is illustrative of the contradictory approach toward minority groups under socialism. As far as Western Europe was concerned, intercultural issues underwent significant changes after World War II, as, for the first time in modern history, Europe became a continent of mass inward migration. In the wake of decolonization, an ever larger number of non-Europeans arrived from former colonies to countries like Britain, France, and the Netherlands. In the economic boom that began in the 1950s, large numbers of so-called guest workers, initially from Italy, Spain, and Portugal, then increasingly from Turkey and Yugoslavia, were recruited for employment in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. By the 1990s, immigration had greatly diversified in terms of the motivations of migrants and their countries of origin. With the emergence of the European Community, later the European Union, intra-European migration began to increase as well. These new patterns of migration raised new kinds of concerns. Cultural differences manifest in residential spatial patterns such as segregation, and new issues of cultural integration began to define discourses on interethnic relations. The collapse of state socialist regimes in 1989 put the question of minorities on a new footing. Democratically elected parliaments and post-1990 governments sought to create legal frameworks in which minority rights were respected and observed. In many cases, these new laws were influenced by the European Union, which was about to expand and later came to include the Visegrad countries, the Baltic states, Slovenia, Romania, and Croatia. Minorities in these countries thus obtained greater legal protections. However, populist and right-wing nationalist parties claiming to represent the entire nation, meaning in fact the majority ethnic population, also pursued aggressive policies against minorities during the 1990s and early 2000s. In some countries, unbridled nationalism led to increasing tensions and discrimination in everyday life. In the aftermath of the Cold War, Europe was also reminded of the dangers of violent interethnic conflict. The breakup of Yugoslavia in 1991 and the subsequent wars in Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo represented the first large-scale interethnic wars on European soil since World War II. These conflicts shared many similarities with those earlier in the century, when the disintegration of multi-ethnic states had led to struggles between competing ethnic groups for sovereignty over their territory. To conclude, interethnic relations and concepts of ethnicity changed much over the centuries. But even by the early 21st century, a commonly accepted uniform definition of ethnicity has never emerged, and the term continues to be related to markers of difference such as religion, language, origin, culture, including the still existing forms of nomadism and itinerant lifestyle, or some combination of these attitudes. In the early modern period, ethnicity, peoplehood, and nation did not have the same political significance ascribed to them by 19th and 20th century nationalism. The 19th century witnessed a national turn that manifested itself in all countries of Europe, deeply affecting the relationship of majority nations with the minorities living among them. The ethnically and culturally homogeneous nation-state became the norm and the ideal, even if that ideal was far removed from the existing realities of most European countries, and particularly far from the conditions of large multi-ethnic states in late 19th and early 20th century Europe. After World War I and the dissolution of former empires, national ideals informed the self-identification of new states and continued to define the strategies of governing elites throughout the century. This development encouraged restrictive or assimilative policies toward national or ethnic minorities, fueling unresolved tensions and in some cases leading to separatist movements. The period between the early 1930s and the late 1940s irreversibly changed the ethnic maps of entire regions. Millions were killed or forced to resettle as a result of World War II. War, genocide, and mass expulsions broke up centuries-old patterns of ethnic coexistence in the victims' places of origin, while the arrival of forced migrants often led to new tensions with the local populace in their places of arrival. After 1945, Europe became a region of mass immigration due to post-colonial global migration patterns and the globalization of the labor market. Until 1989, Eastern Bloc countries, being closed societies under the control of the Soviet Union, stood largely outside the circuits of global migration. However, after the collapse of state socialist systems, they too became countries of arrival for international migrants within an expanding European Union. The 20th century history of Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe exemplifies key problems of interethnic relations. Indeed, the habit of speaking about ethnic groups is far more prevalent in relation to Eastern and Southeastern Europe than it is to Western Europe, though there exist important tensions in minority-majority relations in the latter as well. Conflicts over ethnic difference are just not a specific feature of the East and Southeast, but a reflection of the longevity of nationalist thought and its assumption of ethnic homogeneity. Given the bloodshed and number of victims of nationalist projects, one must use national and ethnic categories with care and critical reflection. One of the most troublesome impacts of the national turn has been on minorities who have never had their own nation-state within Europe, such as Jews, the Roma, and nomads. The Jewish response to the experience of being a stateless people was often a strong identification with the state in which they lived. However, with right-wing political groups and exponents of racial ideologies repeatedly calling such efforts at integration into question, another Jewish response was the rise of political Zionism, a modern nationalist movement that sought to create or recreate a Jewish homeland outside Europe and encouraged the emigration of European Jewry into that new state. The societal integration of the Roma, the Sinti, and of various nomadic groups, such as the Sámi people in Scandinavia, was similarly controversial and remained incompletely addressed in many European countries, even in the late 20th century. Thank you.